The next important unit that we need to see in the 11th standard NCERT is with respect to natural hazards and disasters. This is part of disaster management. Though we are talking about geography, disaster management makes more sense with respect to this. But still, let us see some of the most important aspects with respect to this. But please try to remember that you need to update yourself regularly with respect to disaster management. Only then this will be clear. So let me begin with what exactly is a disaster. See guys, disaster is something which is not in the hands of human beings. But sometimes we say that even human activities leads to disaster. We talk about industrial disasters, right? And second important thing they say is disaster come without informing. There won't be any time. Sometimes when we talk about meteorological department forecasting cyclones and all, it can usually prevent this as well. Third important thing is that it is beyond human control. For example, if earthquake takes place in Antarctica, no one is bothered. But if earthquake takes place in Himalayas, and especially in Kathmandu, other regions where density of population is more, then the impact is more. So what I mean to say is you call something to be a disaster only when it has affected majority of the people and it is beyond human control. So when we look at disasters, you know that Bhopal gas tragedy led to a disaster. Climate change is also creating lot of disasters across the world. What is more important for us is about the classification of the natural disasters. When I talk about the atmospheric based one, we talk about thunderstorms, people die because of it, lightning, tornadoes, cyclones, drought, hailstorm, cold waves, heat waves. This is part of it. Now, this year we have actually had a heat wave also as a disaster. So, this is also important for you. Then I need to talk about the terrestrial. Because of plate movements, we see earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, landslides, avalanches, subsidence, soil erosion. All this is part of terrestrial disasters as well. Aquatic, floods, tsunami, tidal waves, ocean currents, storm surge. Biological, infection, diseases also leads to this, right? So, disasters, first we need to understand what all forms part of disaster. I said you definition. I also want you people to know that this is what we focus on. In this book, they actually talk about the 1994 Yokohama Strategy and Plan of Action for a Safer World. But you have to remember that we have moved ahead and today we have a different strategy and plan where the focus today is mostly associated with the local communities. Today we focus more on the preventive measure. Earlier the focus was more on mitigation measures, that is during disaster and after disaster what needs to be done was usually discussed. Today we are actually discussing mostly about the preventive measures and not about anything else, right? So this is very, very important for us. Next important thing is earthquakes. Whenever we talk about earthquakes, I have already told you that when we say earthquakes, usually there are secondary waves and primary waves. The building moves up, moves like this. So it moves like this because of this building's collapse. So if you are closer to the earthquake zone, then the earthquake impact will be more. Far off, it reduces. So on the basis of this, we usually try to define areas as very high damage risk zone, high damage risk zone, moderate damage risk zone, low damage and very low damage. Yes. So can you see this particular picture? And can you observe very high damage risk zone is actually present Himalayas, and beside that you will have high damage risk zone and then you have moderate damage risk zone. Low damage is peninsula, very low damage is the central part of the peninsula, because as it is stable for several generations, you will not usually find any sort of earthquake in that particular areas. So, establishing earthquake monitoring centers throughout the world, and whenever we should be knowing that these areas are weakened and in future there can be earthquakes in this particular area, and that needs to be avoided. Preparing a vulnerability map, you should know high risk zone and low risk zone, and you have to allow people to stay accordingly. Modifying the house types and buildings wherever it is more industries or something is being present, there can be blast in the industries during this particular period, we have to avoid it. Finally, we have to make our entire ecosystem, lighting and others being eco-sensitive, because whenever earthquakes happens and when this turn happens, it should not lead to electric shocks and other things which may be troubling. The second important aspect is actually with respect to tsunamis. Wherever we have convergent boundaries, in the basics only I have told you, there you will usually observe tsunamis, and wherever tsunamis are there, so from the convergent boundaries it comes closer, and once it comes, we have to be prepared. Asia, especially Indonesia, Malaysia, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, India, Maldives, all these countries are vulnerable to tsunamis. And when we talk about anything associated with tsunami, floods takes place. Along with that, we also need to talk about the cyclones. We have read about cyclones already. No need to think much about cyclones as well, right? So I don't want to talk much about it. I just want to tell you the areas which are actually affected by the cyclones. Can you see very high risk zone is the east coast and some parts of Gujarat and not in other areas, right? So this is very, very important for me. Low damage is the internal part which will not be affected because of the cyclone. Third important part that I have to focus is with respect to floods. Wherever rivers flow, there is high possibility that it may come out, and this may lead to disaster as well, right? If tsunamis occur, floods happens. Tropical cyclones occur, floods happens. And there can be river flow, and there can also be floods because of this. So whenever we talk about the consequences of floods, then you need to be aware that you have to identify the localities which are present in high lying areas. Whenever it is present in the high lying areas, water comes below and it goes out, the high areas will be safe. People should be indicated that cyclone is going to come. People should be aware that tsunamis are going to come, because you know that it takes some time for the tsunami action to take place. And at the same time, whenever you observe flooding, you should allow, because rivers, whenever they have to overcome, obviously you will be having some 4 to 5 days time. So before that, if you can intimate it to the people, and if the people are ready and if they can evacuate it on time, then this does not become a disaster. So this is what we need to understand. And whenever we talk about droughts, we need to understand that there is something called as meteorological drought. That is, according to the meteorological thing, if rainfall is not beyond a particular point throughout the year, then we call it meteorological drought. Agricultural drought, if irrigation or amount of moisture is not available for agricultural activities, we call it agricultural drought. Hydrological drought, if availability of drinking water is not there in rivers, lakes, aquifers for water, and there is no rainfall, we call it that. And then ecological drought is something where ecosystem doesn't maintain because of lack of water, is ecological drought. Entire country is prone to drought, mainly those areas which are actually highly dependent on monsoon. We know that leeward side of the Western Ghats, plains and some parts, especially Bundelkhand plateau region, will be affected. Northeast India gets heavy rainfall, Rajasthan does not get rainfall, so there can be a drought possibility in Rajasthan, Gujarat, Madhya Pradesh. Wherever the black soil is there usually you observe it, right? So it's very, very important for us to understand, because there will be scarcity of food grains, we call occur. Fodder, trinkle, that is for cows and other things, the fodder will not be available. Jalkal, and all this three, if it happens, it will be disaster, which also leads to famine over a period of time. So we have to be careful whenever we talk about this. The next important thing that we have to look at is the landslides. Himalayas, and also when we talk about Western Ghats, landslides usually occur, where in Himalayas it is associated mainly with earthquakes and also with snowfall. In Western Ghats, it is mostly associated with the human construction activities. So wherever landslides happen, so usually if you have a mountain like this, so and if the slope is towards one side, all the rock particles will fall towards that. So you can have the houses constructed on the other side. So here the meaning of this is, if I actually take this, right, so if there is a mountain, everything will fall here. I can have my settlements in this region where this gradient is not usually present. So we have to identify the zones which will be usually affected, and we have to take conscious measures according to that. Please try to read Disaster Management Bill 2005. It's available. First 20 pages of the Disaster Management Bill is very, very important. In future, if possible, we will come up with the disaster management also, but my suggestion to you is, if you can please go through this carefully once, it is more than enough. As it is associated with geography, where they are talking about tropical cyclones and all, it is important. But maps are very, very important in this entire chapter, that is zones. Right, usually whenever they give you disaster management, usually they ask you which are the areas in India which are prone to this, so you have to take conscious efforts to complete that. Fine guys, so we have covered 11th standard NCERT book, that is, we have covered Indian physical geography completely. After this, my suggestion to you, please take up the 10th and 12th standard Indian human geography or Indian economic geography. Physical geography is done, human and economic geography you can read, right? So let's quickly look into those books as well. Thank you guys, thanks for your patience.